Twice now I've done specific line-by-line takedowns of statist bogosity, and that's not including the number of other videos I have debunking statist claims, and all the podcast episodes where I took them apart just like taking apart Kent Hovind, including notables like Paul Krugman. This is the second video in my How to Argue for Statism series, and my first statist challenge. You may consider this to be throwing down the gauntlet. Your challenge is, debunk The Invisible Hand is a Gentle Hand by Sharon Harris, the same way I've debunked those other articles, through fact-checking, spotting the fallacies, and correcting the arguments. In other words, using the proper tools of skepticism. Remember, this is a challenge for you to try to convince me and other rational libertarians that you're right and we're wrong. That's the point of this series, to give you the opportunity to step up and make a proper argument for once. To that end, let me go ahead and tell you what tired old arguments you might be wanting to make that will not work, so you may as well not waste your time. 1. No cherry picking. Please don't waste everyone's time trying to look for that one success story that might serve as a counterexample. It's nothing different than what the president does during the State of the Union address, showing some family who was helped by a subsidy of his, ignoring the businesses that went bankrupt as a result of that very same subsidy, or some military family that served nobly while distracting from the lies he told to support the war, or the drone strikes that kill far more civilians than terrorists. Harris's examples are there to give human faces to the concepts she introduces. If you want to do that, then fine, but you first need to show that they're ubiquitous with regards to that policy. And I'm sorry, but showing someone who, for example, was helped by the war on drugs because of the drug treatment program he was forced into does not counteract all of the lost lives and violence that she points out. And even if you could show that that sort of thing happened all the time, the ends do not justify the means. You have to account for the harm, account for the lives lost, account for the number of people stuck in rape cages because they had a couple of ounces of a plant. Account for these numbers that have only gotten higher, both nominally and proportionally, in the 16 years since Sharon Harris wrote this. Oh, that reminds me. 2. No pointing out that it's dated. Yes, it was written over 15 years ago, but the concepts still apply. In fact, if nothing else, it shows that libertarian ideas are more consistent and more timeless than statist claims which continually have to morph to account for the fact that their policies keep failing. Like when the U.S. government created HMOs by passing the 1973 HMO Act, a corporatist monstrosity that no advocate of the free market would support, and when it failed, said,
"Hey, we need to deal with these horrible HMOs the free market created."
Examples might be dated, numbers might be out of date, but the concepts remain intact. 3. No emotional appeals. It's perfectly fine to put a human face on the statistics, as Harris does, and give the reader an emotional connection to the situation. What you aren't allowed to do is an appeal to emotion, that is, using the emotion itself as an argument. Fair warning, if you want to make an emotional appeal, make sure you back it up with facts and sound reasoning just like Harris did. Otherwise, you won't get anywhere with us. 4. No invisible hand is religion nonsense. As I've shown in other videos, the invisible hand is a metaphor. It's not actually there, and it doesn't refer to any special entity outside humanity, which is how statists love to look at the economy. No, the invisible hand, from the moment Adam Smith first used the metaphor right up to today, has always referred to nothing more than individual human beings engaging in voluntary exchanges in a free market. Because when they do, there's a structure of spontaneous organization that arises, which makes it appear as if an invisible hand guided the process. But there is no such thing, no such top-down model, and in fact, that's the whole point of the metaphor. Postulating some mysterious entity guiding it all would counter the libertarian claim. So no, you don't get to pretend that the invisible hand is some kind of entity we worship or whatever. And don't give me this,
"But some libertarians think it is."
No. No libertarians think it is, and none of you have been able to point to a single one that did. And even if you could, it's clear that Sharon Harris doesn't think of it that way, and she's the one who wrote the article, so don't even try it. If you want to argue with the invisible hand, argue based on what it is, on its own merits. Bottom-up, spontaneous order resulting from the independent and voluntary actions of free human beings. It's just like arguing evolution against a creationist who insists that it all must have been done intelligently from the top down. And speaking of which, 5. No 747 arguments or other arguments from incredulity. In another video, I quoted a skeptic on free thought blogs who tried to argue that libertarianism doesn't work because a rock slide doesn't spontaneously assemble into a cathedral at the bottom of the cliff. Of course, this is no different from the famous 747 arguments of creationists that if you have all the parts for a 747 and throw in a stick of dynamite, it won't assemble a plane. Evolution doesn't work like that, and neither does the free market. In fact, no arguments from incredulity of any kind. Just like with creationist claims about evolution and cosmology, your lack of imagination says nothing about how the universe really works. 6. No appeal to human nature. Inevitably, the statist will bring up human nature and how it proves that libertarianism could never work. There's one fundamental issue that makes this claim a non-starter. There is no human nature. Humans are adaptive and work in the context of the environment they operate in. Do you think human nature changed between 1600 and now? Do you think you're genetically better than people who thought slavery was A-OK and the appropriate punishment for blasphemy was to be drawn and quartered? Give me a break. That's nowhere near enough time for evolution to make the kind of large-scale changes needed to make that big a difference on a fundamental level. But it doesn't have to. The brain is very plastic and can change the nature of the individual significantly and fundamentally once he's put in a different environment. Again, I point you to William Bradford's History of Plymouth Plantation. Under collectivism, people were lazy and dishonest. They shirked whenever they could and stole whatever they could get away with. But then, when Bradford ended that system and moved to one of private property rights, where people kept what they owned and the food they grew and couldn't get away with just taking stuff, things were very different. Now they worked hard, they were industrious, they were more honest, and above all, they were happier. And these were the exact same people who'd been lazy and dishonest just the previous year. That's how quickly it can happen. You've also got a problem with the examples Harris gives. What they show, quite clearly and consistently, is that when human beings work for their own interests absent coercion, they're very different than they are when they're part of a government that can get what it wants but has no accountability whatsoever. You can't get around this just by going,
blah, 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 human nature.
The other problem with this is the refutation libertarians have given for many years. If human beings really are so terrible, the last thing you want to do is take those same terrible human beings and give them the power to use force over others. As Milton Friedman repeatedly inquired, where are you going to find all of these saints and angels to run your policy? 7. Don't forget the gun in the room. This is the whole point of Harris's essay. Things in the free market are done voluntarily. Government does things by force. If you want to defend what the government does, then justify that use of force. Don't pretend it doesn't exist. Don't pretend that we pay reasonable taxes in exchange for services we get, because if that were the case, why would we need to be forced to pay it? And don't pretend that we all agreed to it by voting either, because that would mean things like Japanese Americans agreed to be interned in concentration camps in World War II by one of the most progressive presidents in U.S. history. To do anything like this is like conflating rape with lovemaking. One uses force, the other one doesn't. That's just how it is. Also, don't try to do a tu quoque fallacy and claim that the free market does this too. No, it doesn't. The free market, by definition, is people working together voluntarily. And while we're at it, don't go to this tired old,
but then the first armed gang that comes along will subjugate the population.
First of all, you're ignoring the fact that they wouldn't be the only people that were armed, and that it's really hard to subjugate people who can defend themselves. Second, it's the very height of idiocy to say that there might be some armed gang that imposes its will onto everyone, and so the solution is to have a government, which is a group of armed people imposing their will on everyone. In fact, The latter is worse because government ends up with an air of legitimacy to the atrocities it commits, and that's why you get things like cops beating a mentally disabled homeless guy to death and getting away with it. 8. Remember that the burden of proof is on you. This is probably the most important part of all of this. Harris and other libertarians are just wanting people to be left alone to engage in peaceful, voluntary exchanges. It's the statists who think they're justified in using force to make them behave some other way. And since the statists are the ones advocating force against peaceful people, the burden of proof is on the statists, not the libertarians. So while Harris does a very good job of arguing for the free market and against the state, remember that she does not have the burden of proof here. What that means is that you don't get to behave like the creationists do. You don't get to pretend that if you can just poke enough holes in what she's saying, that you automatically win. No, that's not the point of this challenge at all. The point is that you need to demonstrate that the state is necessary for these functions. You need to prove that the force is justified. You need to account for the atrocities stemming from and unintended consequences of these statist policies. And remember, you don't get to claim any kind of intellectual superiority just because you're the status quo. That could have been used to justify slavery up to the point that slavery was abolished. That's actually a pretty good rule of thumb. Take your argument, go back in time a few centuries, and see what that very same argument would have defended. And understand that if that same argument could have been used to defend a past atrocity, even when we all agree today is an atrocity, then that is an argument that will not in any way convince us. And the same with all the Chicken Little fear-mongering, like the aforementioned armed mob, or dangerous drugs, or poison in the drinking water, or lead pacifiers, or vicious gangs of keep left signs. You don't get to say that all these terrible things would happen just because your precious state has gone away. That's begging the question, and it won't do a thing to further your argument. So, statists, ball's in your court. It's time for you to do the same kind of intellectual responses that I and so many other libertarians have done. Time to see what you've got.